President Donald Trump has created a significant milestone in U.S. foreign policy by setting a deadline for Russia to end the war in Ukraine, threatening heavy economic sanctions if the demand is not met. This deadline is set to expire by the end of this week, with the apparent goal of putting pressure on Moscow to create a turning point in the war. However, with preparations underway for a direct meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, the signals from the White House seem unclear about the next steps. While Trump insists on applying secondary sanctions against countries that continue to trade energy with Russia, he also appears uncertain when discussing the upcoming deadline and sanctions. This issue isn't just about the war in Ukraine, it's also about how the U.S. will deal with its allies and major nations like China and India. One of the key aspects of the U.S. sanctions strategy is to stop buying energy from Russia, an action aimed at weakening Moscow's economy. However, major countries like China and India continue to maintain energy deals with Russia, creating a significant challenge for Trump's strategy. This forces the U.S. to confront a difficult decision: maintain its sanctions policy against these nations or ease the measures to preserve crucial trade negotiations with China and India. Despite signals from the White House about a potential 25% tariff on India for continuing to import Russian oil, a final decision has yet to be made. Sanctions could affect the relationship between the U.S. and these countries and might even impact the global energy market, as Russia and its partners could redirect trade to nations outside the U.S. and Europe. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia under Trump could be described as full of contradictions. While Trump has at times signaled a desire to seek a peaceful solution through negotiations, he has also not hidden his disappointment with Putin, accusing the Russian leader of dishonest and untrustworthy actions. Yet, Trump still seems keen on direct talks, partly because he wants to reach a peace deal on Ukraine, but also perhaps because he understands that a peaceful resolution would be a key factor in solidifying his position on the international stage. A direct meeting with Putin, while no specific date has been set, could be a significant step in Trump's effort to find a peaceful solution to the Ukraine war. However, this decision is not without risks. U.S. allies, especially in Europe, remain concerned that any concessions to Putin could weaken America's position in international negotiations. The relationship between the U.S. and China is currently very complex, especially in the context of the trade war and energy negotiations. As a major partner to Russia, China continues to import energy from Moscow. This creates a paradox in U.S. policy, as Washington needs to maintain trade relations with China but at the same time cannot ignore its relationship with Russia. Alongside China, India is also facing a critical decision as it continues to maintain its energy relationship with Russia. This puts the U.S. and India in an awkward position, because while India is a strategic partner for the U.S., its continued purchase of oil from Russia could complicate economic and trade negotiations. European countries, while supporting U.S. sanctions against Russia, are not without their own contradictions regarding the application of tough measures against Moscow. European leaders are concerned that a meeting between Trump and Putin could be just a way to prolong the Ukraine war without achieving any real solution. This could reduce consensus within NATO and weaken U.S. foreign policy in Europe. However, if this meeting were to actually take place and result in a peace agreement, it could help strengthen the relationship between the U.S. and European nations, while also opening up new opportunities for stability and peace in Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, resolving the Ukraine crisis is a major challenge, and a practical solution remains an open question. This article has only covered some basic analysis. When you request it, I will continue to develop the next parts to complete the piece. In the current international political climate, the relationships between global powers like the U.S., Russia, China, India, and European nations are becoming increasingly complex and multifaceted. The U.S., under President Donald Trump, has been constantly shifting its foreign policy to address these challenges, especially when dealing with the war in Ukraine and global trade issues. Since the war in Ukraine began, U.S. policy toward Russia has been clear: impose strict sanctions to weaken Moscow. However, this strategy is at odds with U.S. trade relations with countries like China and India, which continue to conduct energy transactions with Russia. This puts the U.S. in a difficult position, as it must balance maintaining a tough stance on Russia without damaging other vital relationships, especially amid ongoing trade tensions with China. President Trump has issued a deadline for Russia to end the war in Ukraine, threatening to apply powerful sanctions if the demand is not met. This move, however, isn't a new strategy, but a continuation of sanctions previously imposed. While these measures aim to put economic pressure on Russia, they also have unintended side effects on other countries. A prime example is China and India's continued import of energy from Russia, which not only undermines the effectiveness of the sanctions but also creates complex relationships for the U.S. Washington's policy toward these countries has suddenly become a prominent issue in its foreign strategy. The response of these nations to the sanctions is not only a challenge for the U.S. but also a difficult problem for the entire current international order. The relationship between the U.S. and China has consistently been a point of contention throughout President Trump's terms. The trade war between the two nations has reached a peak in recent years, with the U.S. imposing high tariffs on Chinese goods and officially designating China as a strategic competitor. At the same time, however, China has played a crucial role in energy deals with Russia, especially in the context of Russia's isolation by Western countries. The U.S. cannot deny its trade relationship with China, but China's continued energy ties with Russia create a serious problem. The U.S. faces a difficult choice: continue to increase sanctions on China or de-escalate trade tensions to avoid harming the U.S. economy. However, sanctioning China could have a ripple effect, increasing tensions and pushing China even closer to Russia, which would directly impact U.S. strategic goals. India, a major Asian nation and a key U.S. partner in regional strategy, is currently in an awkward position as it continues to maintain energy transactions with Russia despite pressure from the U.S. Its continued import of oil from Russia has made India a crucial link in U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. could try to increase pressure on India through sanctions, but this could seriously harm the long-term relationship between the two nations. At the same time, India cannot easily abandon its source of cheap energy from Russia, given the needs of its rapidly developing economy. This is a difficult problem for the U.S., as it must both maintain its strategic relationship with India and deal with the reality that India cannot easily give up its relationship with Russia. European countries, while supporting sanctions against Russia, also face their own challenges as they must weigh the contradictions in U.S. foreign policy. Trump's plan to hold a meeting with Putin without conditioning it on a prior meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky has worried European leaders. They fear that such a meeting could simply be a tactic by Putin to prolong the war without achieving any concrete changes. However, Europe also understands that a peaceful solution for Ukraine is critical for regional and global security. If a genuine peace agreement can be reached through negotiations with Putin, it would help stabilize the region and strengthen solidarity within NATO. Yet, if the negotiations are unsuccessful, Europe will have to continue to deal with significant instability. U.S. foreign policy under Trump is facing many internal challenges and contradictions. The uncertainty in decisions and the conflicts among allied nations are making Trump's strategy difficult to implement. However, if he can achieve a peace agreement in the Ukraine war, it could be a major step forward in his political career, while also helping the U.S. reassert its role as a global leader. Despite concerns that the U.S. might be soft on Putin, the reality is that if these negotiations lead to a meaningful agreement, the U.S. could regain trust and support from its allies, especially in Europe. However, if the negotiations fail, the U.S. may face unpredictable diplomatic and economic consequences. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia has always been a dramatic and complex story. Both nations are well aware that if they continue to escalate tensions and conflicts, they will push each other toward a confrontation that neither desires. The war in Ukraine is a prime example of an unnecessary escalation that is proving difficult to halt. The sanctions imposed by the U.S. have failed to force concessions from Russia as Washington had hoped, and in fact, they have worsened already strained diplomatic relations. However, it's notable that President Trump still wants to negotiate directly with Putin, which signals a strategy that is not direct confrontation, but rather a search for a solution through dialogue. In this scenario, the U.S. isn't just dealing with an adversary in the framework of a new Cold War, it must also reassess its approach to Russia. Although there have been meetings and discussions in the past, a lack of trust has always been present. A direct negotiation will not only be an opportunity to find a peaceful solution for Ukraine but also a way for the U.S. to re-establish its influence over Russia. However, this move could lead to criticism that the U.S. is conceding too early, or even being played by a leader like Putin, who is skilled at deception and delay tactics. While U.S. foreign policy focuses on Russia, another equally important issue is China. The U.S. has spent significant time and resources dealing with China through tariffs and intense trade negotiations. However, with China continuing to maintain energy deals with Russia, the U.S. finds itself in a difficult position, needing to balance pressure on China without harming key economic relationships. The question is, can the U.S. adjust its strategy toward China to ensure national security without increasing trade tensions? These decisions not only affect the U.S. economy but also impact the world order. China is a major partner in the global economy and has a huge influence on the energy market. If the U.S. wants to control the situation and prevent China from drawing closer to Russia, Washington will need to find more flexible and nuanced strategies to maintain this balance. India is a crucial nation in the U.S.'s regional strategy, yet it cannot abandon its long-standing relationship with Russia. Despite calls from the U.S. to stop importing energy from Russia, India faces difficult decisions because it cannot ignore cheap energy sources from Russia while needing to fuel its rapidly developing economy. At the same time, India is also dealing with increasing tensions in its relationship with China and regional security concerns. Therefore, India is in a tough spot, as it must maintain a strategic partnership with the U.S. while being unable to easily give up its long-standing energy relationship with Russia. This is a critical factor that the U.S. must consider when implementing sanctions. If India feels forced to choose a side, it could create a strong backlash and damage the bilateral relationship. Europe has always been a key U.S. ally on international issues, especially those related to global security and the economy. However, in the current situation, this relationship is starting to show signs of cracks. While European nations support sanctions against Russia, they are also concerned that the U.S. will continue to pursue a unilateral foreign policy without consulting them. The fact that the U.S. and Russia might proceed with negotiations without conditioning the meeting on a prior meeting with Zelensky has left some European leaders feeling dissatisfied. While European countries worry that Russia could use negotiations to prolong the war, they also recognize that reaching a peace agreement would help end the conflict and strengthen regional security. Europe needs to maintain unity with the U.S. in this foreign policy strategy, but at the same time, they must ensure that the negotiations do not erode the values they have always upheld, particularly in the protection of Ukraine and the stability of the international order. U.S. foreign policy, especially in dealing with Russia, China, and India, is facing many challenges. Although President Trump may find a way out through negotiations with Putin, the implementation of sanctions or trade measures could push the U.S. into an unwanted confrontation with major trade partners. The U.S. needs to reassess its foreign policy strategy, not only through the lens of strategic interests but also by considering global economic, social, and environmental factors. Sanctions must be implemented cautiously to avoid creating unnecessary tensions with key partners like India and China. The current international tensions, especially between the U.S. and countries like Russia, China, India, and its European allies, raise a series of crucial questions about the ability to maintain global stability and peace. The fact that the U.S. has to handle multiple complex relationships simultaneously requires not only diplomatic sensitivity but also a long-term strategy to minimize the risks of trade and military conflicts. The U.S. and its Western allies are facing increasingly complex situations as trade wars, military conflicts, and energy issues intertwine. To cope with this instability, the U.S. will need a more flexible diplomatic strategy, one that doesn't solely rely on sanctions or direct negotiations. It must also consider geopolitical factors, trade, and long-standing cultural relationships. This is especially true with China, where the U.S. needs to continue its confrontational stance on trade while simultaneously acknowledging the importance of trade and energy cooperation. Washington must find the art of balance to avoid harming key interests while maintaining strategic influence. Only when the relationships between the U.S. and countries like China, India, Russia, and European partners are properly managed can the U.S. avoid unnecessary conflicts and ensure long-term stability. The relationship between Russia and the U.S. is one of the key factors determining peace or war in Europe and even globally. While negotiations may lead to some peaceful solutions for Ukraine, that doesn't mean the two nations will become allies. In fact, long-standing issues such as Russia's military presence in Eastern Europe, cyber warfare, or nuclear weapons disputes still need to be addressed seriously and thoroughly. However, meetings between leaders, while they can help ease tensions, can also be an opportunity to find solutions to other international issues. The key is for both Russia and the U.S. to avoid falling into the trap of a prolonged conflict that yields no results. Continuing negotiations, combined with effective sanctions, will be crucial to avoiding an all-out war. China is one of the biggest challenges to U.S. foreign policy in the coming years. Continuing to impose trade sanctions, especially those related to energy, could put China in a difficult position. However, as the world's second-largest economy, China won't easily accept such pressure, especially when it has major trade partners like India and Russia to rely on. This requires the U.S. to have a strategy that doesn't just rely on economic measures but also understands China's influence regionally and globally. Instead of just criticizing, the U.S. should seek opportunities to cooperate with China to solve global issues like climate change, cybersecurity, and arms control. This relationship won't be resolved overnight, but with patience and flexibility, opportunities for peace and shared prosperity could become a reality. India, with its strategic position in South Asia and traditional ties with Russia, is facing many difficult choices in its foreign policy. While the U.S. promotes sanctions against Russia, India needs to continue its economic cooperation with Moscow, especially in the energy sector. However, if the U.S. and India cannot find an effective and flexible mechanism for cooperation, this relationship could be negatively impacted. Finding a balance between partners, from the U.S. to Russia to China, will be a major challenge for the Indian government in the future. However, this is also an opportunity for India to demonstrate its role as a mediator in international affairs. India can leverage the respect it commands from global powers to be a bridge for peace between nations with opposing interests. If India can manage these relationships wisely, it will not only enhance its own influence but also contribute to regional stability. The U.S. is facing one of the most difficult periods in its foreign policy, with many international issues that are not easily solved. Its relationships with Russia, China, India, and European nations will determine the U.S.'s future direction. However, despite all the challenges, U.S. foreign policy can still create change if it knows how to seize diplomatic opportunities while maintaining its military and economic strengths. What's crucial is to have a long-term and flexible strategy, understand the motivations of each country, and be ready to negotiate to find peaceful solutions to global conflicts. Only when the U.S. and other nations truly understand that they cannot solve international issues with force and sanctions alone can they move toward a more stable world order.